Hattie, in the introduction to this paper, refers to an effect size, and in particular an effect size of 0.4, as being the central feature of his analysis. And he claims that an effect size of 0.4 represents the average expected growth of a student from one year to the next. So that's what we ought to look at, is that basic assumption that Hattie promotes. It's interesting to note that there are at least 50 peer reviews that pull Hattie's use of effect sizes and his notion of 0.4 apart because of mistakes, errors, misrepresentations, and other problems. For example, the Canadian professor Bergeron in 2017 did a full analysis of Hattie's work and concluded Hattie's work is a pseudoscience and a house of cards. If we look at some of the class size studies, Hattie originally used 3 meta-analysis. This is one of the 3. Glass and Smith, they summarised their work in a graph showing that as class size reduces from 40 students to less students, there's a clear relationship that achievement does improve. Yet Hattie uses one average of 0.09 to represent that study. Now, the study doesn't report 0.09. Hattie somehow or other calculates it, and I haven't been able to discover exactly how he did it. But I think the big point is that it misrepresents that study, because the authors conclude there is little doubt that other things being equal, more is learned in the smaller classes. The US Education Department commissioned a benchmarking effect size study to look at effect sizes in more detail, and they published a table showing, using standardized testing, showing the difference from young students compared to old students. You can see the effect sizes in the various subjects and quite a difference from young to old. So the question is how can 0.4 represent these various age groups? Hattie actually used this study to justify his 0.4. When he averaged all of these numbers, he got close to 0.4, but seemed to miss the point of what this study was saying. The Education Endowment Fund, which has taken Hattie's work another step and cite Hattie as one of their advisors, report a very different figure. They claim that an effect size of 1.2 is a year's growth. It's quite different from Hattie's 0.4. So that change in interpretation changes the landscape vastly. And the obvious question is how can they be so different? It's interesting to note that using 1.2 as the hinge point rather than 0.4, most of Hattie's influences that he references in visible learning, I think all but 2 fall below 1.2. So I guess you could, if you consistent with Hattie's argument, then all of those influences would be, as he calls them, distractions. When challenged about this in an interview in 2018, Ollie Lovell was able to get some other answers out of Hattie. Hattie retreats and said it's about the story, not the numbers. Then he says something very interesting. That's why this will keep me in business, to keep telling the story. So what Hattie means by the story is the detail of the studies, but he seems to forget that using one average effect size completely misses the story. And then later on, Hattie, when pushed, admits that his rankings are misleading, and he said it worked, then it got misleading, so I stopped it. John O'Neill, many years ago, a professor from New Zealand, wrote a timely warning about Hattie. I think pretty much reveals what Hattie's trying to do. O'Neill calls Hattie a policy entrepreneur because Hattie positions himself to champion and shape and benefit from school reform discourses. And I think this paper with Pearson is another example of that. Thank you.